Welcome to Azra Bazaz's Knowledge Corner. Making of a Global World, Part 2. In this part, we will be studying about the wartime transformations. You all know that the First World War was fought between the Allied powers, that is, Britain, France, and Russia, and later US joined. Once Russia withdrew from the war, US joined the war. And the Central Powers, that is Germany, Austria-Hungary, Ottoman Turkey, and Italy. First World War brought about many societal changes. First thing is, it was the first industrial war to be fought, meaning all the arms and ammunition were manufactured. I'm saying manufactured in the industries. Whether it is tanks, whether it is ammunition, whether it is chemical weapons, aircraft, anything. The second thing being, the finances of the household were now being looked after by the women, meaning the burden of the finances fell on the women. They were looking after or taking care of the young and the old. The third thing was United States of America, from being an international debtor, became an international creditor. First World War came to an end in 1918, but the recovery was slow and painful. Britain had been preoccupied with war, but India and Japan were fast using the opportunity to build industries, that is, industrialization of India and Japan. After the war, India became dominant in the international market, and so also Japan started competing internationally. Britain had borrowed from United States of America, and Britain was now, at the end of the war, totally burdened with huge external debits. The war had led to an economic boom. The government tried to reduce the war expenditures and bring in peacetime revenues. Agricultural economies also saw a crisis. Take, for example, wheat. Prior to the war, Eastern Europe used to supply wheat to the whole of Europe. But during the war, all this stopped, and wheat came in from Canada, America, and from Australia. Post-war, Eastern Europe went back to production of wheat. So the end result was huge amount of wheat was dumped in Europe, and buyers were very few. This led to the prices of the grain falling, the rural incomes declining, and the farmers falling more and more in debt. It is said that trillions of tons of wheat was burnt in US to stop the prices from falling further. US did see a short time of economic trouble, but very soon it recovered. And there was a new era of mass production. For example, Henry Ford, a car owner from Detroit, what did he do? He introduced the assembly line example in his automobile industry. Now, assembly line, he took the example from Chicago slaughterhouse and he introduced it in his automobile production factory. Now, the only thing he did was he banned the trade unions, increased the salaries, and he made the workers to work on the assembly line. Meaning, if a worker had to tighten the bolts or tighten the screws of any part, then he had to just do that work throughout the day. Now, Henry Ford, what did he do? He increased the speed of the assembly line. The result was there would be no delay. The worker had to work faster. He could not take a break, and he could not even have a friendly word with his workmate. And the result was more and more cars started coming out. Along with it, the housing and consumer boom also started in US, which led to prosperity. The middle class households could now afford the so-called luxury items like vehicles, TVs, fridge, and all on hire purchase, meaning what you see today, you say EMIs and all that. Same thing at that time we used to say hire purchase. All this did not last long. The bubble burst in 1929 when Great Depression started and lasted till mid-30s. Now, how did the Great Depression come about? It started with the agricultural overproduction. See, first one. It started with the agricultural overproduction. Now here, as the agricultural overproduction was seen, I've explained to you there was huge amount of produce being produced, because of which the loans or the investments by the banks could not be recovered. Secondly, the US had given loans to most of the countries of Europe, which it could not recoup. The withdrawal and the banks, seeing a little bit of non-recovery, started recalling the loans at a greater rate. Now, this led to the failure of major banks, and the industry could not get loans from the bank. It was like a chain reaction. Agricultural depression led to the failure of the banks. The failure of the banks led to industrial, failure, leading to the crashing of the stock market in 1929. Round about 110,000 companies collapsed. Unemployment was on the rise. People stood in queues asking for jobs. You can see as it is shown in the picture. India did suffer from Great Depression, but then, because it was a colony of the British, the effect was not great. Though India had been reduced to a supplier of raw material from a supplier of finished goods, the effect was felt, but not to such a great extent. There were no purchasers for cotton and jute, but the revenue or the taxation remained the same, that is sky high. The farmers had to sell their gold in order to pay the taxes. Many households lost their land, lost everything, and were reduced to penury. Jammu and Kashmir also felt the impact of Great Depression. Peasants were unable to pay the high land taxes, and it resulted in agrarian indebtedness and deterioration of the condition of the peasantry, leading to unemployment, food shortage, and starvation. Adverse condition also led to trade having a slump. This region at that time was high with grievances. The Second World War broke out 2 decades after the end of First World War. So, one generation of people have seen the First World War, the Great Depression, and the Second World War. The death and destruction was enormous when compared to the First World War. Crucial influences shaped the post-war reconstruction. US emerged as a dominant economic, political, and military power in the Western world. Soviet Union in the Eastern world. Soviet Union had made huge sacrifices to defeat the Nazi Germany, and also had transformed himself from an agricultural country into world power during the very years where Great Depression, the world was suffering from Great Depression. Economists and the politicians knew that industrial society based on mass production could not sustain mass consumption. Markets could not guarantee full employment, and therefore the governments had now to be totally involved in the day-to-day development of the nation. The second lesson was the country's economic links with the outside world. The goal of full employment could only be achieved if the government had the power to control the flow of goods, capital, and labor. And here, the any country could not depend heavily on imports and exports. And that is the reason local market had to be developed. To develop the local market, the wages had to be improved or increased so that the people of the country could purchase the goods that were produced within the country. And thus, in order to maintain an economic reconstruction, United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference was held in July 1944 at Bretton Woods in New Hampshire, USA. It established International Monetary Fund and International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, in short, the World Bank. We refer to them as Bretton Woods sisters. Now, from where did the money come to IMF and the World Bank? The Western countries, though had an economic slump, they did have money on their own, and which they invested in the World Bank and IMF. And World Bank in return lent money to the Western countries to do post-war recovery. Now, post-war recovery, once the Western countries recovered, their economies recovered, then the IMF and World Bank turned towards what we know as the third world countries or the colonies of the European nations or newly independent countries. But the encouragement from the World Bank was lukewarm. Now, these third world countries had to compete with the industrially developed Western nations. And that's the reason they organized the Latin American countries, African and Asian countries, organized themselves into Group of 77 or G77 to demand a new international economic order. Now, here the competition was the third world countries were agrarian economies. Now, in order to develop their to bring about an economic development, these countries needed to compete not on the price but on the quality of the goods that they produced. Over a period of time, industrial know-how, agricultural know-how was shared by these G77 countries, which led to an overall development by the third world. Despite years of stable and rapid growth, all was not well. It was still limping, but then the ideas of Bretton Woods came to an end and globalization started taking root. Now, what is fixed exchange rates? Fixed exchange rates was today if you want to buy a dollar, the rate of the dollar against a rupee fluctuates. But in those times, fixed exchange rate, it means it didn't fluctuate. But now we have floating exchange rates where floating exchange rates are determined by demand and supply of foreign exchange. This is the announcement for the... Due to this, the Western commercial banks and private lending institutions started giving loans and development assistance to the developing countries. The industrial world was also hit by unemployment and also high cost of employing people in the Western world. And that's the reason the multinational corporations started to shift their productions to low-wage Asian countries. China had been cut off after its revolution in 1949, but the economic policies in China, then collapse of Soviet Union, all this brought back many countries in the fold of the world economy. The wages were relatively low in countries like India and China, and that's the reason they became attractive destinations for the MNCs from the Western world. Today you will see that the relocation of the MNCs to to the countries of China and India have led to the overall development of these countries, that is India, China, and even Brazil, to a very great extent. So, we are coming to an end of the lesson, The Making of a Global World. I hope I have been able to explain the lesson easily for you. Take care, all the best.